Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm doing an Are They Dupes video and I'm going to be comparing this new Wet n Wild Glamour Squad palette to the Soft Glam palette by Anastasia. So we are going to be comparing these two palettes today to see if they are dupes. With this new Wet n Wild palette, I know it is like not the easiest to find. Like I went to probably 6 or 7 Walgreens before I found this eyeshadow palette. Wet n Wild released this palette and 3 other new palettes. As far as I know, this palette is going to be part of Wet n Wild's permanent collection because nowhere on this packaging does it say limited edition. This palette is $4.99. The Soft Glam palette runs $42. So that is a huge price savings. The Soft Glam palette does come with 14 eyeshadows. The Wet n Wild palette only comes with 10. So there's definitely going to be some shadows in this palette that obviously the Wet n Wild palette is not going to be able to dupe just because of the fact that this palette doesn't have as many shadows. The shades in the Wet n Wild palette, they're not quite as buttery as in the Soft Glam palette, but when you apply them, I don't have any issues with them not blending well or having a ton of fallout. Like they blend really nice. I find, and as you will see in the swatches, they are pretty comparable and are pretty close dupes to each other. I'm just gonna do this like going through the shades in the Soft Glam palette. The shadow on the right hand side is gonna be the ones from the Soft Glam palette, and then the ones obviously on the left are gonna be from the Wet n Wild palette. The first shade in Tempera, this is one of the shades that the Wet n Wild palette does not have a dupe for, but I do have a pretty close dupe to this shadow in the new e.l.f. The New Classics palette. And there's a couple of dupes in this palette that the Wet n Wild palette doesn't have. So the color in Cream in this e.l.f. New Classics palette is a pretty close dupe to Tempera. It's slightly a little brighter, like a little bit more white, where Tempera is just a little bit more of cream, like a cream color, but they're pretty close dupes. The Wet n Wild palette does have a dupe for Glistening. And as you can see in the swatches there, the Wet n Wild shadow, like when I turn my arm and the light hits it in a different way, you can tell that that shade looks slightly darker than the shade in the Soft Glam palette. But when you look at it straight on, they look almost identical. The next shade in Orange Soda, the shade that is the closest dupe to that in the Wet n Wild palette is the top transition shade. And as you can see in the swatches, the Wet n Wild shadow is slightly a little darker, and I find that that color is actually a better dupe for Burnt Orange in the Soft Glam palette. So as you can see in the swatches there, Orange Soda is the first color, the middle shade is the Wet n Wild color, and then the shade on the end, on the far left, is Burnt Orange. The next shade, which is in Rose Pink, the dupe for that in the Wet n Wild palette, as you can see there, it's pretty close. Like these are pretty close dupes to each other. The Wet n Wild shadow is just slightly a little lighter than Rose Pink. The next shade in Sultry, the Wet n Wild dupe is slightly a little darker, or maybe like a little muted, and Sultry is just a little bit more like shimmery. It has more sparkle to it. They are pretty close dupes to each other. I mean, once you get them on your eyelids, you really can't tell much of a difference, and I find that to be the case with most of the shades. The dupe for Bronze, it is slightly darker and it's a little less shimmery than Bronze, but once again, they're pretty close dupes. The next shade in Mulberry, they are pretty much spot on dupes. I find that Mulberry, I don't know, like the texture of that eyeshadow is like a little bumpy. Like it has good pigmentation to it, but it's not as smooth as the other shades in that palette. I just prefer the Wet n Wild shadow to that one. Okay, the next shade in Dusty Rose. Now, this is a color that the Wet n Wild palette does not have a dupe for, so I tried to look at my other palettes and find the closest dupe that I could to that shade. And once again, the e.l.f. The New Classics palette, the shade that I found was the closest dupe to that is this color in Charming. And Charming is just slightly a little bit more purple then Dusty Rose. So they are a little different, but that is the closest dupe that I could find in my collection. Okay, the next shade in Fairy. This is also another color that the Wet n Wild palette does not dupe. There's not a shade for that color in that palette. And I was looking through my eyeshadows, and honestly, I couldn't really think of a good dupe for that shadow. The next shade in Burnt Orange, I already showed you guys the dupe to that one, which was the top transition shade in the Wet n Wild palette. Sienna. So the dupe for that in the Wet n Wild palette, this is another color that is a spot on dupe to the Soft Glam palette, and once you get this color on your eyelids, like, it looks like the exact same color. I love the formula on both of these. Like, they're both really pigmented, and yeah, so that's definitely a dupe. The next shade in Rustic, the Wet n Wild dupe is pretty close. It's slightly a little muted compared to the one in the Soft Glam palette. The next color in Cypress Ember, I was a little disappointed with the color in the Wet n Wild palette. Like, the more I swatched that transition shade, the more it wanted to go hard pan on me. And as you can see, that color swatch next to Cypress Ember, it looks a little ashy, which was disappointing. Like, I don't know what it is about that color in the Wet n Wild palette. Like, I don't know if it's just my palette, but it just didn't seem to have really good pigmentation. And then whenever you tried to build it up, then it just made the eyeshadow just go hard pan. So I don't know, maybe it's just my palette, maybe they're not all like that, but I actually found a better dupe to Cypress Ember in the e.l.f. The New Classics palette in the shade Muse. They are really close dupes. Muse is just slightly a little muted. And then the last shade in Noir, is it Noir or Noir? As you can see, swatch next to the Wet n Wild color, they are really good dupes, and honestly, the Wet n Wild one seems even more pigmented and even more black. So I definitely feel that this Wet n Wild palette is a good dupe to the Soft Glam palette. It's not an exact dupe just because this has 10 eyeshadows and this one has 14, but the colors that are in this palette are dupes to shades in the Soft Glam palette. And if you wanted to kind of make up for those 4 shades, you could get the New Classics palette from e.l.f. And then the only thing that this one's lacking is just the shade in Fairy. If it had that color, then this would be a good palette to get to supplement the Wet n Wild palette, you know, to complete the dupes in this palette. So I hope that you guys did enjoy this video, and I hope that you found it helpful. If there's anything that I can do to improve these dupe videos, let me know down in the comments. So yeah, if you guys did enjoy this, please give this video a thumbs up. I hope that you guys have a great day. I will be posting a tutorial on this eye look, and I actually use this Wet n Wild palette to do like the colors in my crease and lower lash line. Obviously on my lid I have some glitters going on, so I didn't use this palette for that, but that tutorial will be coming soon. So yeah, I hope that you guys have a great day, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye-bye. Mwah.